Hi everyone, I'm Sasha and I spent my semester researching the recent election and how social media, specifically Twitter, affected the results. So, why did I choose this topic? Well, as a political science major, I was obviously really interested in campaigns and elections to begin with. This was also the first election that I could vote in and that many of my friends could vote in, so seeing how everyone was reacting to it was really, really interesting for me. I also was one of the people that follow the candidates on Twitter throughout the election period. So I really wanted to see what studies had been done in terms of how their Twitter accounts affected the outcome of the election. And I was really interested to also see how the polls didn't predict the outcome that we got. So the timeline of my research question has changed quite a bit. In my first source evaluation, I was focusing on how Donald Trump surpassed expectations and rose to presidency in the United States. But I quickly ended up narrowing this down a little bit more in my third and fourth source evaluation, where I asked what kind of social media strategies did Donald Trump use to attract attention to his campaign, and how did the use of these social media attract and persuade US citizens to vote for him, leading to his victory. In my fifth source evaluation, I also added something to the end of it, and I asked if Twitter or news media ultimately promoted Trump's campaign. So this led to me to my final hypothesis, which was during the 2016 election campaign period, Donald Trump was not predicted to be the victor. However, his extensive use of social media and billions of dollars in free publicity pushed his campaign over the top and ultimately led him to become the next president of the United States. So, some of the conceptual frameworks that I used included the invisible primary phase, which refers to a time period where candidates rely on the media to propel them forward in their campaign. I also use something called the hybrid campaign, which is the use of traditional and non traditional means to lead a campaign. Essentially, in Donald Trump's case, he led a hybrid campaign by participating in traditional campaign efforts like press conferences, as well as non traditional means such as his high use of social media. And it also used political communication, which is how information spreads throughout politics and news media. And in this case, essentially how Donald Trump was able to relay information about his campaign to the public. So I used several case studies in my research, and one of the first articles I used was called Pre-Primary News Coverage of the 2016 Presidential Race, Trump's Rise, Sanders' Emergence, Clinton's Struggle by Thomas E. Patterson. Um, so this quote was really important to my research because it talks about the invisible primary phase and it acknowledges the clear distinctions between each candidate's media coverage and saying, whereas media coverage helped build up Trump, it helped tear down Clinton. Trump's positive coverage was the equivalent of millions of dollars in ad buys in his favor, whereas Clinton's negative coverage can be equated to millions of dollars in attack ads with her on the receiving end. So you can clearly see how the media coverage they received really did affect their campaigns. The second quote that I have on here came from an article called How Trump Drove Coverage to the Nomination, Hybrid Media Campaigning, Political Communication by Chris Wells and a lot of other authors as well. And they went to say that these strategies cultivated the impression of bare knuckle authenticity, a blue collar billionaire that communication scholars have long argued is lacking in modern politics and appeals to disaffected voters. So, this article discusses a lot about hybrid campaigns, and this quote is specifically used to discuss Donald Trump's original use of social media. As in, he was never really politically correct. And because he had this raw mentality and verbiage, it really appealed to a lot of unsatisfied voters. I also used another case study called, and the article was called Twitter as an Arena for the Authentic Outsider, exploring the social media campaigns of Trump and Clinton in the 2016 US presidential election by Emily Gunn. And one of the quotes that I used from that was that the divergent Twitter strategies around user engagement of the two campaigns in the 2016 US election point to a fundamental difference between professionalism and amateurism in the social media strategies of the two campaigns. So, this is basically talking about how different Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton's strategies were, in the sense that because Hillary Clinton was an established politician, she was expected to be professional, whereas Trump was a businessman. And so while people expected him to be a professional, he wasn't. And he really had this amateuristic vibe going throughout most of his social media campaigning. I also used another quote from the same article, which says politicians are increasingly required to have a performative flexibility in the interest of connecting with voters, moving comfortably between different format criteria and expectations, from the formal to the informal, from the professionalized to the personalized. So, why this is important is because Donald Trump really used this language that people were not used to and was super politically incorrect. And because he didn't have a filter, this made his campaign feel much more personal to a lot of his supporters, and even those who weren't necessarily supporting him, but just were looking at his campaign as well. So the counter argument to my study basically said that television is still a very dominant American election related media, and Twitter is more peripheral. And it also argued that social media is reactive rather than predictive. So people aren't really going onto social media and indicating who they'll be voting for. It's really just a reaction to what certain candidates might be saying. However, my counter to this was that the use of social media has changed tremendously since the 2012 election, which is where I got this information from, and that social networking sites and news media have really come to work hand in hand. So you're not really going to see something on one and not the other, especially something that has to do with an election. I did have quite a bit of research problems during the semester. So, one of them was definitely narrowing down a topic because it was such a recent event. I had trouble kind of figuring out what I wanted to focus it on because it was hard to find any research about like a certain generation, like focusing on millennials or gender or anything like that. So, finding research was also really difficult because this was something that's still so recent, and obviously many people are still researching it. And also just finding articles related to elections. A lot of them were focused on other countries, and so that really couldn't help me because I was focusing mine on the US election. So, after all of my research this semester, I came to the conclusion that because of the use of social media and how it is constantly changing, it's really important for politicians to recognize the role that it's playing during their campaigns. So, for instance, while Hillary Clinton was trying to keep a professional outlook, that really didn't work for her because she was already receiving so much negative publicity. It also concluded that Donald Trump won the social media campaign because he refused to be politically correct. So because he had this raw sense to him, he really didn't feel the need to censor his words because he wasn't a politician. He was a businessman and he knew that, and he made it very clear, but that's what got people's attention. And also that Trump's original approach resulted in billions of dollars of free media attention, which ultimately put him at the forefront of the election. And this subconsciously influenced voters. So whether people realized it or not, they were starting to gravitate towards Donald Trump. And that's all. Thank you guys for listening.